All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Traphagen. I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of BSCS Science Learning. I am also a biology teacher at Oak Park and River Forest High School in suburban Chicago. I've worked with BSCS in various capacities for a while. First, as a brand new science teacher in the Boston Public Schools, I used BSCS Human Approach curriculum, and I heard a lot about their instructional approach in my teacher training. Then in 2012, did a BSCS PD, the AP Biology Leadership Academy, where coincidentally I met one of our panelists, Cindy Gay, when she was a high school teacher in Colorado. And at that meeting, there was a call for a classroom teacher to serve on the board of directors, which I thought was really powerful, that BSCS was so committed to listening to teachers and being so closely tied to teaching and learning in the classroom. So essentially, I got pulled in by the curriculum, and I've been part of it ever since. So BSCS, for those that might be less familiar, conducts rigorous research and turns that research into programs that science students, teachers, and leaders need. I've spent the last 2 years field testing and teaching one of BSCS's newest programs, BSCS Biology Understanding for Life. And from the time of my teacher preparation through the adoption of the next generation science standards up through now, it seems that the two conversations we're always having in science education are getting students to engage in the science practices and also offering students experiences that are relevant to their lives. And I'm so excited that you get to hear more about this program, because I think this does those things like nothing else I've used in the classroom. And the story I like to tell about that, in the fall of 2020, so sort of a low point for many of us in terms of science teaching, I was field testing this curriculum, and we were talking about exponential growth in bacterial populations in the body. So what happens during an infection? And one of my students, and keep in mind, this is a class for students reading below grade level, and they had not yet seen exponential functions in their math classes. And she points to the low part of the exponential curve, and she said, "Oh, this is what's going on with COVID." And like any good biology teacher, I have my explanation locked and loaded. Well, there's a difference between bacteria and viruses. But instead I said, "So can you tell me a little bit more about that?" And she said, "Well, down here at the low part of the exponential curve, this is when you can really do something. We really need to be careful before infections go up." And I was just blown away. This was her first exposure to this type of growth curve. And she was taking something from one context and using it in a way that was directly relevant to her life. So I'm so excited that you get to hear more about this approach and this program. So I should probably introduce our two speakers, who both played a huge role in developing this program and preparing teachers to effectively implement it in their classrooms. They were also critical to the development of the program's new instructional model that we're all going to hear about today. So Lindsey Mohan is BSCS's Associate Director for Innovation. Following her doctoral studies in educational psychology and educational technology, Lindsey spent a few years teaching middle school earth science in a rural public school in Texas. She will tell you that her time spent in the classroom actually putting these instructional theories into practice made a big impact on the approaches and strategies she advocates for today. She joined BSCS in 2017 and has invested much of her time focused on the development of two major instructional materials projects, including this BSCS Biology and the Open SciEd Middle School Science Program. Cindy Gay is a senior science educator at BSCS. Her graduate research was focused on Arctic and alpine vegetation ecology, and she went on to spend 34 years teaching science in Colorado. The bulk of that time was spent teaching high school biology and AP biology, and she has received widespread recognition for her time in the classroom, including the Presidential Award for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching. After participating in BSCS professional learning and field testing as a classroom teacher, she joined BSCS in 2016, and now she's on the other side, developing instructional materials, programs, and professional learning for science teachers and leaders across the country. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lindsey and Cindy who are eager to introduce BSCS's latest innovation in instructional materials design.
Thank you, Stephen. I love that story about your student too. So welcome to everyone who joined us today. We invited you here today to learn about our latest innovation in instructional material design. If you're a longtime friend of BSCS, you know about our 5E instructional model, and you're probably excited about what we're doing next. If you're a newer friend of BSCS, you may be curious about our work and what we do, and you might be wondering what we're doing at a time when science education is more important than ever. So Cindy and I are really excited to share our latest innovation called Anchored Inquiry Learning.
Thanks. The Anchored Inquiry Learning instructional model and future BSCS innovations to instructional material designs are significant steps in our ongoing journey the broader science education community has been on for decades. Here at BSCS, we've embarked on this journey as teachers and science educators, as scientists and education researchers, as parents of science students, and as lifelong science learners ourselves. Many of you here today share one or more of these identities too. According to the survey responses that many of you shared prior to the webinar, you're lifelong science learners, you're teachers and parents, you're professional learning providers and curriculum developers, you're scientists and education researchers. Each of you here today has been part of this journey, and we're so grateful to have you with us.
So this journey we're talking about is one towards scientific literacy. At BSCS, we have many different programs and we have different unique approaches in those programs, but they all share one thing in common. They all point to a vision that we share with the larger science education community and you all for a scientifically literate society. Now, to understand where we're at today in this moment on our progress towards scientific literacy, it's helpful to reflect back on that journey we've taken over the years towards this aim. So we're going to start our journey in 1958, and this is when BSCS was founded. So it's a really special time to us. It was a time when the nation was investing a great deal of money and effort to advance our country's leadership in science and innovation. This time is often referred to as the Sputnik era. So I found this quote from President Eisenhower to Congress, where he's sharing about how the government is funneling a great deal of money into the newly formed National Science Foundation, or NSF. And then NSF, in turn, was funneling that money into science education, which is how we were founded. So notice, though, how President Eisenhower says all this money going into science education is to assist in laying a firmer base for the education of our future scientists. So at this time, the goal towards scientific literacy was really to prepare that cadre of scientists that would help maintain a competitive edge for the United States. Now, let's jump ahead to the late 1980s, 1990s. And this is the moment in history when BSCS launched the 5E instructional model. An important shift had happened. So at this time, you're going to see a much clearer focus on scientific literacy for the everyday community member, not just scientists. So this is a quote taken from an influential book at the time called Science for All Americans. You might be familiar with it. It was published by AAAS. And notice how the focus is on a science literate person. And this science literate person has an awareness of science, mathematics, technology. They understand key concepts and principles of science, right? And they can use that scientific knowledge and those scientific ways of thinking for individual and social purposes. So this version of scientific literacy might feel pretty familiar to all of us. And you might be wondering what kind of progress we've made since 1990s. So let's fast forward to today, the new moment in history when we're launching this Anchored Inquiry Learning model. Here's a quote from Gitanjali Rahul, a young teenage scientist. Now, she invented a device that detects lead in drinking water faster and more affordably than the existing technology. And she did this in response to the Flint water crisis. So in this quote, she says, "The biggest motivating factor is the community around me." And she talks about wanting to connect to real problems, real places, and the people experiencing those problems. So this is what motivates her science and engineering work. She also explains, my goal has really shifted not only from creating my own devices to solve the world's problems, but inspiring others to do the same. So what's new about scientific literacy today? Well, you see a much greater focus on identifying with science, on connecting with science in a really personal way, and on being able to use it to participate in change for our communities. Now, this version of scientific literacy is not some aha. It's been around for decades. It's just becoming increasingly more central to our work in science education, especially at BSCS. So this journey I've taken you on to reflect on our progress towards scientific literacy shows that we've come a long way as a science education community, right? We've recognized scientific literacy is important. That's great. That it needs to be for all, yay. And then that it needs to be for life, which is where we're at today.
So as Lindsey shared, at BSCS, our goal has always been scientific literacy. Our path to attaining this goal in science classrooms has always been engaging students in learning through inquiry. Now, we define inquiry as the act of inquiring, asking questions and trying to gather information and evidence to figure things out. But just as our understanding of what scientific literacy means has changed over time, so too is our understanding of what inquiry looks like in science classrooms. So let's take a look back to consider how inquiry learning has changed over our 60+ year history. So we'll start back in 1958 when BSCS was founded. Back then, inquiry was an elite endeavor. Scientists and engineers did the work of learning through inquiry. Prior to the first BSCS high school textbooks, students in classrooms learned about inquiry indirectly by studying the scientific work that was done by elite scientists. Our first biology textbooks, fondly called blue, green, and yellow, some of you may remember them, introduced the idea of scientific inquiry in classrooms across the country. According to the survey responses that we collected from you prior to this webinar, 63% of you learned science this way. Here's what some of you recalled. In high school, I was just fascinated by learning about what we already knew. Most of my classes were really traditional, lecture style with a few lab activities sprinkled in. One of you shared, it was my least favorite class. It felt very much like a march through the textbook. Amazing that I became a high school biology teacher at all. By the 1990s, our vision of scientific literacy and inquiry learning became more inclusive and resulted in some significant shifts in teaching and learning. Students engaged in labs and investigations that replicated those of scientists. These curated investigations produced results that confirmed what scientists and engineers already knew. Engagement in prescribed inquiry like this, it looked like following procedures, confirming results. And when our results didn't match what was expected, we just attributed it to experimental error. 33% of you remembered learning science this way. So here's a few of the memories you shared. I remember sitting at black lab tables with lab worksheets and boxes to fill out, doing cookbook confirmation and canned labs. I had an amazing middle school science experience where we acted like scientists and had guest speakers. And my favorite, I got kicked out of my senior physics class for asking too many questions the teacher couldn't answer. In science classrooms today, huge and exciting shifts in inquiry teaching and learning are happening again. Students are engaging in authentic inquiry with messy, real-world phenomena and problems. The same complex phenomena and problems that scientists and engineers are also seeking explanations and solutions for. The same phenomena and problems that lie at the heart of complex societal challenges that affect all aspects of student lives and the lives of their families and communities. Challenges like antibiotic resistance, the risk for heart disease, designing sustainable food systems, addressing biodiversity and human-caused change, climate change, and social justice. Today's inquiry learning looks like students engaged in science and engineering practices and ways of thinking to figure out important science ideas. They develop habits of mind that are useful, not only in developing and revising explanations and solutions in their science class, but in all contexts of their lives, outside of school and into their future. Now, only about 4% of you said you learned science this way, but many of you shared a common vision of today's inquiry learning, including that students are positioned to do the work of a scientist, rather than only reading and replicating work already done. That students are authentically wondering about a natural phenomenon and being given access to resources to make sense of it. That students are tackling complex questions, grappling with messy data, and engaging in authentic scientific habits like argumentation and revision. But why are we on this journey? Why are we driven to improve scientific literacy and inquiry learning for all? Well, we live on a planet with a growing human population and increasingly complex and global issues. We live on a planet with finite and in many cases diminishing resources. The stakes are high. The volume of information available to us in the palm of our hand is increasing exponentially. Not only do we seek information ourselves, but unsolicited information is continually presented to us through media feeds. Not only is there more information available than we can take in at any given moment, it also varies widely in its accuracy. So where do we go for information we can trust? To make informed decisions about the complex issues that affect us, our families, our communities, our planet, we need to decide what information to consider and the accuracy of that information. The stakes are high. It'll take each of us to tackle these issues. We can't just wait passively and depend solely on scientists and engineers to explain complex phenomena and solve our problems. We need a scientific literate society. We need students in our classrooms today and those of tomorrow to develop scientific literacy, a scientific literacy that will empower students with agency to use their understanding of science ideas to better their lives and communities and to participate in solving our complex global challenges. To accomplish this important journey, we have to continue to refine our instructional models.
So that brings us to a reflection on the 5E instructional model, given these ambitious goals for science education that Cindy just shared. So the 5E instructional model worked really well for short and focused inquiry sequences that might play out across 5 to 7 lessons. It worked so well, it became a pervasive model in science education. But it wasn't designed to support learning about these complex phenomenon over longer units of instruction. As we found ourselves designing materials in recent years to support investigation of these more complex phenomena, we recognized that this kind of learning was going to take more time and that we couldn't expect students to understand and participate deeply with these complex phenomenon in short, focused inquiry sequences. We needed something new. So now's the time to introduce you to anchored inquiry learning. We launched this model in our new high school biology program, a program called Understanding for Life, which is the program that Stephen talked about at the beginning. We plan to continue to integrate anchored inquiry learning in our future programs too. Anchored inquiry learning is inspired by today's educators and students, and it's based in contemporary research, and it's really a reflection of the world that we live in. So the model has 3 key goals. It's designed to motivate students to learn, engage students in productive inquiry-based learning activities, and prepare students to organize and reinforce their learning beyond the classroom. Now, anchored inquiry learning lives in a family of phenomenon-driven, problem-driven instructional models. And so for this reason, it might feel familiar to you if you've designed curriculum materials or taught using these kinds of models. I'm going to walk you through an example of how an anchored inquiry learning plays out across a unit of instruction so that we can see the architecture of the model together. So first, every unit begins with an anchor lesson. Now, this lesson gives us a shared experience of the anchoring phenomenon. It generates curiosity and also uncertainty. It also positions us to ask lots of questions. So, for example, the first unit in our new biology program begins with an anchoring phenomenon in which a young boy gets especially sick from a bacterial infection, and the infection doesn't respond to medicines typically used to treat the problem. So students are puzzled by what's happening to this boy. They ask lots of questions, and those questions are used to develop a driving question board like the one you see on the slide. Those questions then launch us into several investigation lessons where we gather evidence and we generate new ideas about what could be happening. Now, after several investigate lessons, we engage in a consensus building lesson called a synthesize lesson. We examine all the evidence we've collected, and we can now explain part of the phenomenon that we didn't understand at the start of the unit. So you can see an example explanation here on the slide. But that phenomenon is pretty complex, and we still have gaps in our understanding. So we then spend a lesson called a gap analysis lesson, revisiting gaps in what we understand. And we focus ourselves on a new set of questions from our driving question board that we can't answer yet. Those questions launch us into a new inquiry cycle of investigate lessons, where we gather more evidence and we generate more science ideas. We then synthesize our understanding again, which is shown in this new updated explanation on the slide. And we refocus on remaining gaps and questions we have. We then gather additional evidence through our last series of investigate lessons, our last inquiry cycle. And now we have a pretty complete explanation of the anchoring phenomenon. So while we've been applying new ideas and understandings along the way, the unit ends in a culminating task. And this culminating task is a meaningful application of science to an everyday scenario. So in the example unit from our high school biology program, students develop a personal checklist, which you can see in the lower corner of the slide. And this checklist is for a doctor's visit, so that students in the position of a patient will be better prepared to ask questions of their doctor. Now, you'll notice that students do a lot of investigation, which is the gathering of evidence in response to their questions. And it's the generation and refinement of new science ideas. You'll also notice that students do a lot of consensus building together when they take stock during these synthesized lessons and gap analysis lessons. So this representation characterizes an anchored inquiry learning unit that may play out over several weeks. Some units may have fewer inquiry cycles. Some units may have more. A benefit of this model is that you can have a shorter unit, like a 3-week unit, or you can have a longer unit, like a 9-week unit. It really just depends on the complexity of the anchoring phenomenon and on the number of inquiry cycles necessary to investigate it and related phenomena more fully. So there's a few important characteristics of anchored inquiry learning that make it both similar to and different from other models in that same family of instructional models. So I'm talking about problem-based learning models and storyline models. And we want to briefly touch on 4 of these characteristics. So the first one here is that it centers students' questions and ideas, and it follows a sequence of learning that makes sense or is coherent from a student's perspective. It embraces the collaborative sense-making process. It helps students apply science to everyday life. And it includes these routines that give a predictable cadence for teachers and students across time. So we're going to look at all 4 of these. So this first characteristic, that that anchored inquiry learning centers students' ideas and questions and follows a sequence of learning coherent from their perspective, it's really important. This means a unit of instruction might not follow the typical approach that a teacher as a content expert might take. Instead, it really truly is designed to follow students' questions and curiosities and what they're figuring out along the way. Now, this characteristic of anchored inquiry learning has been really strongly influenced by our collaborators at the Next Generation Science Storylines. This team really pioneered the idea of storylining from a student perspective. And we embrace this approach because when students realize that they not only get to ask questions, but then investigate them, it becomes a really powerful motivator for student learning. So the second characteristic is that anchored inquiry learning embraces the collaborative sense-making process. There is a whole lot more of we versus me. And you probably noticed that I said we a lot, we and us a lot as I was describing what happens in a unit. So the collaborative sense-making process is designed to be inclusive. It's designed to get all ideas on the table. It's designed for the class to make sense together so that students feel a part of a classroom community working towards a shared goal, and so that students don't feel isolated, working on their own to figure things out. And all of this learning in the classroom is designed to better prepare students for everyday life scenarios, real scenarios, not contrived ones, like preparing for getting the most out of your doctor's visits. How science plays out in society is complex. We know that from what Cindy shared earlier. So learning in science classrooms should help students practice and prepare for that complexity outside of school. So the last characteristic, which really sets anchored inquiry apart from other related instructional models, is the cadence it creates for learning activities. When we started down this path toward developing the new instructional model, we knew that one of the strengths of 5Es was the cadence or rhythm that the 5Es created. It made teaching and learning predictable. And we wanted the new instructional model to provide a similar kind of cadence. So as we sat back and developed our thinking around anchored inquiry learning, we thought of all the regular routines that happen in science classrooms, from asking questions, generating initial ideas, gathering evidence, generating an explanation or a model or an argument. And through this process, we identified different kinds of activities that repeatedly happen, and they're listed here on the slide. We call these routines. These routines appear over and over across the lessons. And because they happen so often, teachers and students come to engage with them even more naturally over time. So we don't have time in today's webinar to dig into these routines, but later we'll show you where you can go to a website to learn more about them.
Now, we've just examined the structure of the anchored inquiry learning instructional model. But how does anchored inquiry learning play out in and out of the classroom? What stories have we heard from students, teachers, administrators, and parents who've experienced anchored inquiry learning? How would you know if you were in a classroom using this instructional model? Well, you might be in a classroom using anchored inquiry learning if students are making connections between the science ideas they're figuring out and their lives. Jordan, a high school biology student, was sick and went to her doctor, who ran some immune response tests in order to make a diagnosis. Now, these happen to be the same tests that Jordan learned about in a unit on natural selection and infectious disease, the same one Lindsey used in her model. Imagine being a high school student and feeling both confident and relieved when the doctor mentions C-reactive proteins, or CRPs. Because Jordan had developed an understanding of the role that these proteins play in her body, she felt comfortable engaging in conversations with her doctor about possible treatments. In another district, an emerging multilingual student was hospitalized. When the counselor went to the hospital to provide emotional support, the student said, "I'm not worried about it. I'm learning about this in Mr. G's class." You might be in a classroom using anchored inquiry learning if parents are seeing the connections their students make between science ideas and their lives. Sala has a son with severe food allergies. She emailed his teacher, "I'm so happy Anil was learning about how the immune system works. He was doing homework and just came downstairs to ask if I wanted to know how allergic reactions work." It made me laugh after all these years of trying to teach him vigilance about food allergens. Thanks for doing this job better than I can. He really loves and absorbs the learning from you. I'd long been hoping the science behind his reactions would interest him. You might be in a classroom using anchored inquiry learning if all students, and I mean all students, are engaged with the content and ready to take action to improve their communities. Raul, a teacher in Chicago, told me about a conversation he had with an at-risk student. The student walked into Raul's class one day and announced that this was the only class they'd be attending and admitted plans to ditch all their other classes. The student said they were coming to biology because it was the only class where they talked about things that mattered. Raul replied that he was touched, but the student really needed to go to all their classes. In Colorado, after studying matter and energy in food systems, students learning English and science in a sheltered class petitioned the school administration and food service department. They asked for more culturally relevant foods like rice and beans. They wanted those on the lunch menu. They presented a scientific argument that these plant-based foods are more sustainable and have lower environmental impacts than many of the animal-based foods that were currently on the menu. They further argued that these foods have really important cultural significance for many students in the school's population that were receiving free and reduced lunch. The school added more rice and beans and is working towards adding other more sustainable and culturally relevant foods to the lunch menu. Okay, I could share so many more stories about students and teachers and parents who are already seeing the impact of anchored inquiry learning in their classroom. But really, I think Taylor captures it best. I've always done well in science class, but I usually didn't have a very deep understanding of the concepts we learned. I could regurgitate the definitions we needed to know for a test, but that was about it. Mr. Lane's style of teaching without lectures and note-taking has really helped me to actually comprehend the information we learn, because it's gotten me to think about science in a different and more creative way. I no longer think the subject is boring, and I can appreciate how amazing our world is through science. I'll remember the things I've learned in his class for years and years, rather than just long enough to get an A on the unit test. Change is happening, and it's exciting. Already, we're hearing about a shift in the interactions and conversations between students, parents, teachers, and administrators. So I want to share a few observations that science leaders and administrators in California, Illinois, and New York have reported. They've shared that teachers' planning conversations have shifted from discussing topics and choosing activities to indicators of student success as they engage in science practices. Teachers are discussing and planning how to support students in figuring out key science ideas and applying them in new contexts. When administrators are in classrooms for observations, they see a transformation in teaching and learning. They observe less stress and anxiety in the room. Students aren't concerned about how many points a task is worth because they're focused on the question they're trying to answer. Parent-teacher conferences no longer focus on how a student could improve their grade. Conference conversations are now centered on strengths and areas for growth in the students' explanatory models. Administrators have also reported decreases in, and in one case, no parent phone calls to administrators about grades or student issues. Students are communicating to their parents about their progress towards the learning goals and the importance of what they're figuring out. And this gives me chills. Leaders in multiple districts found that anchored inquiry learning approach, it meets the needs of all students, making it possible to use a single curriculum across all courses, even in a track setting. The relevance of figuring out authentic and important science ideas means there are entry points for all students, whether they're in an entry, general, or honors course. It means more opportunities for all students to demonstrate mastery because the complexity of the phenomena requires regularly looking at the whole discipline and its implications for their lives, rather than just focusing on topics and facts.
That's exciting. Anchored inquiry learning is our most powerful instructional model yet, and it's a huge step forward in our journey towards scientific literacy. And that's because it centers students in a way we've not done before. So in this clip, which you can't hear, that's intentional, just watch the kind of interaction though occurring between the students. Notice the smiles, notice listening to each other, notice the comfort they have sharing their ideas with each other. Watch the classroom culture that's been created here, and watch how the learners are participating in the learning process. We hope this kind of learning experience can help students feel ownership over what they investigate and what they figure out, and to draw on their resources and assets as diverse learners from diverse communities. We also hope that by creating this kind of culture in the science classroom, learners will come to see science is for anyone. It's for everyone. And in particular, we want to empower learners from communities experiencing inequitable impacts from those local and global problems, who too often are also from the same groups who have been historically excluded from participating in the science and engineering to solve those problems.
The science education community has long been on this journey towards scientific literacy for all. In this webinar, we've shared our organization's 60-plus-year journey towards this goal. We've shared a glimpse at the culmination of our own inquiry into instructional models, anchored inquiry learning. We're so excited about this instructional model and how it incorporates current research on the best practices for effective science teaching and learning, and especially the way it's transforming classrooms and impacting student lives. We're excited to celebrate with you how far we've come. This is a really proud moment in the BSCS history of instructional models. Even while this webinar is happening today, students across the country are engaging in anchored inquiry learning as they experience BSCS Biology Understanding for Life, our brand new high school biology program. But wait, there's more. As powerful and transformative as the BSCS Anchored Inquiry Learning instructional model is proving to be, we know our journey towards scientific literacy for all isn't finished. We view Anchored Inquiry Learning as a midpoint rather than an endpoint in this journey. Because the world and our planet's complex issues are going to continue to change. Future generations of students will undoubtedly be faced with global challenges we've yet to even imagine. Education research will continue to reveal gaps in our current understanding and suggest new innovations. And just like inquiry learning in the classroom, our continuum of instructional models has been and will be based on inquiry. We will continue to research and learn from others to figure out best practices for effective science teaching and learning. We'll continue to innovate and refine our instructional models. We're truly excited to share this work with you to ensure that all students and teachers in all science classrooms have equitable access to the most robust instructional model available today, and to ensure that all students and teachers in all science classrooms have equitable access to the most robust instructional model available tomorrow as we continue to learn and innovate. We still have a journey ahead. As Marie Curie said, I was taught that the way of progress was neither swift nor easy. We look forward to continuing our journey with you. Lindsey and I want to recognize our team at BSCS who contributed to the development of Anchored Inquiry Learning. While Lindsey and I are fortunate to be here today participating in this webinar with you, getting to this point was a highly collaborative effort from many, many thoughtful people at BSCS. We've got a huge team who provided not only inspiration for this work, they gathered together to workshop ideas, they provided feedback as we tested the model and instructional materials. And we really want to thank you. Thank you for joining us today. So you can learn more about Anchored Inquiry Learning and support our work on our website,